Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. The images of the North Korean, Chinese, and Russian leaders standing together in Beijing have now faded, but the diplomatic ripple effects are just beginning to take shape. Since the parade, talk of a deepening trilateral alignment has triggered swift reactions from Washington, Seoul, and beyond. U.S. President Donald Trump expressed surprise at not being mentioned in Xi Jinping's speech, while analysts are parsing what Pyongyang and Moscow gained from the show of unity. Now, South Korea is under growing pressure to figure out where it stands and how to respond. To help us break down the diplomatic fallout and what it means for South Korea's next moves, we're joined by Bruce Bennett, adjunct defense researcher at the RAND Corporation and a leading expert on security dynamics in Northeast Asia. A big welcome.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us. So let's get right in. So we saw the picture of the three leaders of the three countries standing together for the first time since the Cold War. Through this, what kind of message do you think they're trying to send to the international community?
First of all, we have to note we don't know what they're sending. But what we can assume from their behavior, the situation, is they all three hate the United States. They think the United States is weak right now, that it's a time where they can exploit that weakness. And so they're trying to show a degree of unity in an area where they have shared interests to counter the U.S. influence. I think ultimately their objective is to break the ROC-U.S. alliance. It may not happen this year or next year, but they're going to be working on it very solidly. And this is just one of those attempts.
Right, so their ultimate goal could be to interrupt the Seoul-Washington alliance. But with this goal, do you think this high-profile gathering could actually mean a strategic, a tangible partnership between the three?
Well, we have to step back and ask what their big objectives are. You know, China's big objective, Xi Jinping has been very clear that by 2049, he wants to be the global hegemon. Putin has also been pretty clear that he wants to be a global hegemon. Well, those two interests aren't consistent. And Kim Jong-un has been very clear that he doesn't want to be told what to do by either of them. So I think we have to look at this and say they have some shared interests, but this is not a strong alliance like NATO, where the underlying interests are largely shared. This is a very weak alliance that will try to exploit the vulnerabilities of the ROC-U.S. alliance. And we have, therefore, a better opportunity to counter what they're doing.
So their short-term interests are aligned, but long-term interests could be really different.
Really different. They don't want what the other country wants.
Right. Now, just a couple hours ago, we're hearing that the Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, and North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, are actually holding an in-depth summit in 6 years. It just happened around 7 p.m. Korea time. What should we read into this timing of their summit and the purpose of their meeting, and what could they have been discussing?
Well, so to understand this, we have to go back to the 1980s. We have to remember that Kim Il-sung was very, very good at playing China off against Russia. He would get something from Russia, and then he would go to China and say, hey, I got this from Russia. What can you give me that will be as good as that? And then when he got that from China, he then turns to Russia and says the same thing. Well, Kim has been getting lots from Russia. Now, he's given Russia a lot, but he's been getting lots from Russia. Historically, for the last many years, he hasn't been getting that much from China. China has been very moderate in what they have given North Korea. So Kim is now at a point where he is undoubtedly trying to leverage China, to get more from China by saying, hey, you know, I'll just stick with Russia if you can't come up with something more interesting to me.
So what could we assume that Pyongyang is wanting from Beijing?
Well, economic assistance, certainly. Assistance with breaking the UN sanctions, which China and Russia have both been trying to provide. But I think a lot of it is economic and military. You know, the military could be any one of a number of military systems that are provided either in numbers or a technology is provided. And so, you know, part of what they're doing is undoubtedly talking about what China could give North Korea that the North is not already getting from Russia.
Right, so we'll have to see how the results of their latest talks ended in the couple hours. But let's zoom in a little bit to Pyongyang. So after years of sticking into, you know, one-on-one diplomacy, it was a debut for Kim Jong-un on the multilateral stage. What do you think prompted him to appear?
So I think we have to again draw back and say, what's the situation he's facing? I think there's lots of evidence that he has internal insecurity, that he's worried about instability in the North. He goes to Beijing, and with Putin and Xi, he's their peer. Well, golly, he's telling his elites, I'm a superpower. I am wonderful. And I'm doing wonderful things for North Korea because I am so powerful. I think that's his objective, is to deal with internal issues. You have to remember, the soldiers he sent to Russia, they weren't hostile class soldiers. They weren't wavering class soldiers. They were core class soldiers. They were sons of the elites. Those families have one son in most cases. That son is killed, that family goes away forever. That's not going to be well received by those elites. So Kim is now trying to work on his internal issues as well as external issues.
So he's also looking into domestic affairs.
Yes.
But there is also some saying that aside from, you know, what Pyongyang could get from Beijing, there's also sayings that this latest intention of Kim Jong-un could be boosting leverage for a possible negotiations with the United States. What are your thoughts on that?
I think Kim at this stage is not very anxious to negotiate with the U.S. Why? To negotiate with the U.S., many of his elites have to meet with American elites and talk and exchange notes and so forth. Look at how diligently Kim has tried to prevent outside information from getting into North Korea. If his elites are talking with outside elites, they're going to be bringing back all kinds of outside information. You know, if you look at the time when Kim declared that unification was dead, he was renouncing it. Ambassador Julie Turner of the United States said, Kim is doing this because he's afraid of the outside information coming in. And I think that's a key issue that we've got to remember. Does that mean he will never negotiate with the U.S.? No, at some point he may well decide to do it, but I think he recognizes it as a risk that he wants to carefully control.
So he's waiting for the perfect time.
The perfect time, and where it looks like he can very quickly conclude a favorable agreement and not have his people hearing all of these outside stories.
Now let's shift a little bit to South Korea's view. So North Korea, China, and Russia are getting closer, apparently, and the U.S.-Japan axis are firming up. What kind of diplomatic room does President Lee Jae-myung actually have to maneuver?
Well, so he's tried to maneuver by negotiating directly with the North, and the North has said, no interest, don't want to talk with him. But then the North said that about Trump as well. Trump tried to send notes to Kim Jong-un, and the North Koreans refused to accept his notes. So at this stage, there's no negotiation process going on. What that means is we have to start recognizing that you don't have to sit down at a negotiating table to negotiate. They could negotiate by offering carrot and stick packages. For example, the U.S. and South Korea could say to North Korea, your uranium enrichment facility that you introduced, Kim Jong-un, last year, a year ago, that's unacceptable to us. You're going to be making too many nuclear weapons. So you need to shut that down by December 31st. If you do, and if you allow the IAEA to come in and monitor it, here are the sanctions that we will cancel so that you get a benefit from doing that. That's the carrot. The stick would be for the US and South Korea to say, if you don't do that, we now have to start balancing your nuclear weapon buildup. One way to start that process is to remodel the US nuclear weapon storage in Korea. The US hasn't stored nuclear weapons in Korea since 1991. There is no way the US will bring nuclear weapons to Korea and put them in storage facilities with 1980s computer technology. So those need to be modernized, but we need to do it in a way that it makes it look like we're not just trying to cause problems for the region, we're responding to Kim's causing problems to the region.
Right. So that kind of a transactional parasitic approach could be helpful because we're not seeing North Korea's response in the negotiating table. Now, but in response to this this latest parade, President Trump actually said that he was very surprised that Xi Jinping didn't mention Washington in his speech, and he called Xi Jinping a friend. He also praised the event itself as very impressive. Given all this, how should we interpret Washington's stance on the latest, happenings?
Well, we have to remember that Trump is all about America first. If you go back to World War II, China probably wouldn't have defeated the Japanese without the American help. So for Trump, this is a case of China slighting the United States, the help that we gave them. But that shouldn't be a surprise with where we are today. I think, though, that if you look at the rest of what he said, he's not been very successful with his foreign policy initiatives. He didn't end the war in Ukraine the first day in office. He hasn't stopped the war in Gaza. I think he's not prepared to take on subjects that could be a losing proposition. He's simply trying to sweep this one off the table by saying, yeah, they did a good thing. They kind of worked out. And it's not a US versus China where it could look like he didn't succeed.
Right. Now, let's also look ahead to the APEC. Xi Jinping is reportedly planning to visit the leaders' meeting here in Gyeongju, South Korea, and this would be his first visit to South Korea in a decade. So in light of the recent developments, do you think this latest visit could become an actual turning point in Seoul-Beijing relations?
Well, certainly that's what Xi hopes, I think. And I think it's, to a certain extent, that's what President Xi hopes, that it will strengthen the South Korea-China relationship. China is your biggest trade partner. There are advantages to having a stronger relationship, getting better deals with Chinese companies and the government. So I think there is that hope in both China and South Korea. But think about President Trump. That's not his view of the world. So there is a risk that by going too far in that direction, they will be exactly accomplishing the objective they've just tried to do, undermining the alliance. So I think President Xi is in a very touchy position. How does he balance those two objectives?
Right, so we're definitely stuck in the middle.
Exactly.
Right,
exactly.
so a very cautious approach would be necessary moving forward. But let's zoom out a little bit. So we're expecting the UN General Assembly ahead. There could be a meeting between President Lee and President Trump there. What kind of a joint message could the two have to revive kind of a connection or talks with North Korea there?
So to revive the talks with North Korea, I go back to my unilateral carrot and stick proposal. Kim is not going to respond if he thinks he's got nothing to get out of negotiations. If I looked at the situation right now, I don't see what he would hope to gain from the current proposals. If there is a concrete proposal put on the table that could hurt Kim if he doesn't do it and could benefit him if he does, that, I think, is something that might motivate his action. He may not do very much. He may still say, no, I'm not going to do it. Then we have to be prepared for a next step and a next step. And that pressure is something Kim regularly responds to. if you can put real pressure on him.
So the leaders could be also preparing and should be preparing for the next steps, other plans, if this negotiation process doesn't actually work out.
Right, exactly.
Now, before we let you go, so this regional order continues to shift and alliances try to harden. What kind of diplomatic identity should South Korea now be aiming for?
That's a difficult question because there are so many competing interests. But I think we have to remember, if somehow the alliance with the U.S. is undermined and the U.S. removes troops, the alliance dies, that's really not good for the future of South Korea. So President Yi is in this position where somehow he's got to sustain the alliance while still trying to accomplish his economic objectives, which means doing more with China. This is a very narrow area where he's got to operate. But you look at public opinion polls in South Korea. Without the alliance, North Korea looks militarily superior. And I think Kim probably doesn't want to invade South Korea anymore. He invades South Korea and his soldiers will come in and they're going to see South Korean society. That could be deadly for the North. So I think what he wants is he wants to be in a position to dictate to South Korea. I'm militarily superior, your alliance with the US is gone, and he's not going to ask for a whole lot. Just give me 50 trillion won a year, South Korea. That's less than 5% of your GDP. I don't want 100 trillion, because that will make people in North Korea too rich. And when they get rich, they bribe officials, and I lose control. But I do want a certain amount of money, and oh, by the way, no more K-pop. K-pop is bad for my younger generation, Kim would be saying. So don't let that happen anymore. That's a relationship South Korea does not want to have.
So as of now, President Lee's pragmatic approach would be necessary. And in the end, how South Korea actually defines its role may matter just as much as what lines it would align with.
Yeah, what we find in the national security community is we do a lot of wargaming and saying, what if this situation happens? What do we do? What if this situation happens? What do we do? We really need a lot of that right now to ask, how is it that President Yi can accomplish his objectives? And if he does this, is that a good idea or a bad idea? Trying to test those situations. He did a marvelous job with President Trump. Coming from the political differences between the two individuals, and he got a favorable response from President Trump. It wasn't a Zelensky experience. So President Yi has done well, but there was no policy memo coming out of the Washington summit. That says we've got a lot of work to establish the policies needed for the future.
Right. South Korea will have to see how these kinds of policies would actually become more take shape. But as for now, we'll have to conclude our discussion here at this point. Thank you so much for your insights tonight.
Certainly, my pleasure.
We appreciate it. And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.